The prisoners safely locked away, Riel proclaims the end of Hudson's Bay Company control over all of Rupert's Land.
We have only acted in conformity with that sacred right which commands every citizen to oppose the enslavement of his native land with all his strength.
Louis Riel is soon named President and Commander-in-Chief. But it is not just a military occupation. For several months, he leads a provisional government with French and English members. It includes A.G.B. Bannatyne, a popular English resident who serves as postmaster, and the reluctant James Ross, who becomes Attorney General. Riel is now in a strong position to deal with Ottawa on his own terms. But the path to negotiation is brutally interrupted by a fateful decision. Inside Fort Garry, the prisoners are taunting their Métis guards. The most violent among them is Thomas Scott, an Ontario Orangeman. He brags that he will personally kill Riel if he ever gets out. In early March, Scott is overheard insulting Riel.
The Métis are a pack of cowards. They will never dare shoot me. I want nothing. You are a pack of cowards.
Riel appoints a tribunal to try Scott for inciting violence against the Métis. On it are some of Riel's most trusted confidants: Ambroise Lépine, Elzéar Goulet. The military tribunal convicts Scott. He is sentenced to death. Some English residents beg Riel to reconsider, but he is adamant, saying they must make the government of Canada respect them. On March 4th, 1870, Scott is blindfolded and dragged outside.
The Globe, April 1st, 1870. It is with special regret we have to report that Mr. Scott has actually been put to death. It is said he was murdered, not because he had broken his parole, but because he was an Orangeman and obnoxious to the priests. It is very likely that he was so treated because he was a poor man, and not likely, in Riel's estimation, to have any powerful friends to make much ado about his death.
Word of the execution stirs passions in Ontario. There are calls for Riel to be hanged. The Ontario government even puts a bounty out for his capture. Riel does not apologize for the actions taken.
Consider the circumstances. Let the motives be weighed. If there was a single act of severity, one must not lose sight of the long course of moderate conduct during the troubles of 1869. We sought to disarm, rather than fight, the lawless strangers who were making war against us.
But as the tension escalates, secret diplomacy is also underway. A team of 3 negotiators arrives in Ottawa from Red River, led by a soft-spoken country priest. Father Noel Richot is deeply loyal to Riel. He goes armed with a list of demands for a new province they wish to call Manitoba. To avoid igniting a firestorm in Ontario, Macdonald and Cartier meet the delegates at a discreet distance from Parliament Hill. John A. Macdonald is confident he can stare down the inexperienced prairie delegates.
If we once get them here, we will easily deal with them.
But they are stunned by the steely determination of Reach-Shot. The priest demands everything be put on the table, and soon they are discussing full provincial status, responsible government for the citizens, provisions for separate schools for Catholics. Reach-Shot argues them into granting 1.4 million acres of land to the children of the Métis.
To conclude this important business, we spent about 75 hours in discussion with Sir George and Sir John. Matters are going well for our poor but brave people of Red River.
In May 1870, their work is done and a new province is born. With the completion of the transfer, the young Dominion of Canada has acquired a landmass of 2.3 million square miles, 30 times the size of Britain, and tucked in the corner of the vast territory, a small province called Manitoba. With protections for French and Catholics and a people now known to the world as the Métis.
No matter what happens now, the rights of the Métis are assured by the Manitoba Act. That is what I wanted. My mission is finished.
But Ottawa is not finished with Riel. He will not be granted amnesty for his actions. To appease Ontario, MacDonald sends a military force west. In May, 400 British regulars and 800 volunteers set off for Red River. They are commanded by Garnet Wolseley. His instructions are to ensure a peaceful transition to a new government. They cross Lake Superior. Portage around Kakabeka Falls. And after a long journey over land and water, finally reach Red River. Wolseley is keen to capture Riel himself, but Riel guesses his intention and slips out of the fort, leaving his breakfast unfinished. With the Métis leader gone, the soldiers are still eager for action. Wolseley keeps his British troops in order, but the volunteers from Ontario run wild, setting off on a violent rampage. One day they spot Elzéar Goulet. The killing of Goulet causes horror in Red River. And convinces Riel he cannot risk giving himself up to Canadian justice. In the coming years, he is constantly on the move. Friends receive letters from Montreal, New York, and Montana, where he marries and has 2 children. The man whose actions led to the birth of the province of Manitoba is now an exile in the United States.
I am grateful to the flag which protects me, not too unhappy in my misfortune. Louis Riel.
In 1858, a London Times correspondent reveals the secrets of a hidden part of the empire.
The soil and climate are good, healthy and genial. Timber, coal and fish abound without limit. And as the country becomes better known to the world, there can be no doubt that its advantages would be better availed of.
Indians, who number about 75,000, have always known about the riches of their land. And now, those riches are claimed by white settlers. By the mid-1860s, the heady days of the Cariboo Gold Rush are coming to an end. Most of the prospectors have moved on, but thousands remain. One of those seeking a fresh start in British Columbia is William Smith. He was born in Nova Scotia, but moves to California as a young man. He is a mystic and an eccentric.
What I love most, love of order, beauty, the world, the universe.
To persuade any doubters, he changes his name to Amour de Cosmos, lover of the universe, and moves to Victoria. Like most of the newcomers, he is single. There are almost no white women in the new settlements, and the church frowns on mixed marriages. One man complains of his constant loneliness.
There is probably no country where the paucity of women in comparison with men is so injuriously felt. Oh, if 50 or 100 should arrive from England every month until the supply equaled the demand, what a blessing it would be to us.
Women are sent for, and in 1862, the first shipload arrives from England. They are welcomed aboard HMS Grappler. Edmund Hope Verney is the commander.
One female was carried up helplessly intoxicated, and 2 or 3 more were evidently the worse for liquor. There is not a shadow of doubt in my mind that at least 1 or 2 of the women are thoroughly bad, and must have been so before leaving England.
But the newspaper records many happier stories.
Several of the girls are about to be married. 6 marriages were proclaimed in church the other day.
Among them, John Leach weds Mary MacDonald. The young arrival later becomes the organist for the Anglican Cathedral. British Columbia hopes to attract other settlers with generous land grants. Europeans are offered 160 acres each. Indian families are expected to make do with 10. Amour de Cosmos, now editor of the British Colonist, has no qualms about displacing the Indian population.
Shall we allow a few vagrants to prevent forever industrious settlers from settling on unoccupied lands? Not at all. Locate reservations for them on which to earn their own living, and if they trespass on white settlers, punish them severely.
14 Indian bands have signed treaties with the British, giving them some protection from encroachment by settlers. But Joseph Trutch, the new land commissioner, wants these rights rolled back. He calls the previous agreements purely symbolic.
These presents were, as I understand, made for the purpose of securing friendly relations between those Indians and the settlement of Victoria, then in its infancy, and certainly not in acknowledgement of any general title of the Indians to the lands.
It is not the view of one Niska elder.
I am the oldest man here, and I can't sit still any longer and hear that it is not our father's land. Who is the chief that gave this land to the queen? Give us his name. We have not heard it.
Amor de Cosmos dreams that Canada will inherit the land. He believes it is time to cast off the colonial mantle and join the Dominion. That puts him at odds with most of the colony's elite, who still prefer the British connection. The debate might have gone nowhere had it not been for a sudden turn of events. In 1871, the distant Canadians invite BC to join them on highly favorable terms. They promise to build a railway over the Rockies within 10 years. The astonished politicians of BC would have been content with a wagon road. Amor de Cosmos, soon to be BC's second premier, is swept off his feet.
We have become allied with a people who will rule the northern end of the American continent for 1,000 years.
Wild celebrations in Victoria mark the entry of British Columbia into Canada. The First Nations do not join in. The excitement is echoed at the other end of the country, where Macdonald and Cartier have seen their vision realized.
We are going to tie the oceans together. 100 victories carried over the opposition please me less than the presentation of such a bill. This is my pride and joy. Dear Sir Hugh, the friends of the government will expect to be assisted with funds in the pending elections, and any amount which you or your company shall advance for that purpose shall be recouped to you.
The cozy relationship between the railroad people and powerful politicians has been a fact of life for 25 years in Canada. Governments have sunk countless millions into the railroads, and in return, Grand Trunk money has often bailed out politicians in need. Money greases all party machines, but in 1872, a scandal breaks out. It will all but destroy Macdonald and Cartier's dream of a transcontinental railway. Sir Hugh Allen is one of the richest financiers in Canada. He has made his money in mines, shipping, and the telegraph. That July, Macdonald and Cartier are worried they may lose their majority in the pending elections. Cartier spells out his needs to Sir Hugh.
Now wanted, Sir Johnny Macdonald, $25,000. Honorable Mr. Langevin, $15,000. Sir Georges-Étienne Cartier, $20,000.
Macdonald is re-elected, and Sir Hugh Allen gets his reward, the presidency of the Amalgamated Canadian Pacific Railway Company and the coveted contract to build a railway to BC. There are whispers of scandal everywhere. Montreal Liberals bribe a clerk in the office of Allen's lawyer. They soon find what they are looking for. Macdonald awaits the gathering storm. For once, he will have to weather it without his closest colleague at his side. For some time now, Georges-Étienne Cartier has been feeling unwell. His seemingly inexhaustible energy has given way to constant fatigue. His limbs are swollen. His hand shakes when he writes. The man who once had an iron grip on Montreal lost his seat in the 1872 election. That September, he arrives in London to consult a specialist.
My dear MacDonald, I am so weak, I cannot hold a pen. I use Josephine to write.
Dear Sir John MacDonald, on Sunday night, the evil work became conspicuous. Maman gave the alarm. He rallied his strength and told us himself, I am dying.
When MacDonald announces Cartier's death to the House of Commons, he is overcome. Too distraught to continue, he raises his right arm over Cartier's empty desk and stands, frozen in grief. In June, Cartier's body arrives in Canada. Lady Dufferin, wife of the new Governor-General, happens to be changing steamers in Montreal.
Looking out, we saw, passing slowly in the darkness, the steamer with the body of Sir George on board. It was a striking moment. The chapel lighted up on board, the band playing and bells tolling at sea, answered by bells tolling on the shore.
Cartier was as bold as a lion, but for him, Confederation would not have carried.
By the summer of 1873, the misdeeds of the MacDonald government have landed on every table in the country. Every day, more details seep out. Though Cartier and Allen's names are all over the Pacific scandal, MacDonald himself has much to answer for. But now, no one can find him, including his wife. MacDonald has gone to ground. The Globe is content to report wild speculation.
From early morning, a rumor has been current that the Premier had been drowned at Rivière-du-Loup. According to some, accidentally while bathing. And according to others, that he had attempted to commit suicide by jumping from the wharf into the water.
In the dying days of summer, MacDonald reappears in Parliament. At the end of a long debate over his government, he rises in the House.
I have fought the battle of Confederation, the battle of Union, the battle of the Dominion of Canada. There does not exist in this country a man who has given more of his time, more of his heart, more of his wealth, or more of his intellect and power, such as they may be, for the good of this Dominion of Canada.